Okay, just the one. Okay, gotcha. Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna be at that one for sure. Because we're doing a and all of that. We're gonna follow Yes, he's the other one.
Oh, there's three, so there's actually like five.
Thank you so much.
Well, good evening. Mic on? Hear me okay? All right, well, this evening we have our third honors evening of the semester. We are having 6 this semester because we have 21 excellent students, and we want to give at least most of them a chance to do a public presentation. These presentations in this auditorium are the most formal, and so there's nowhere to hide. And so please, no tomatoes, no cucumbers, although they're easy shots up here. So this is our third honors evening, and we have, again, 3 interdisciplinary presentations. Claire Arden is a senior from the Midwest, I want to say Indiana, is that right? And Claire is going to be speaking to us about linguistic fingerprints of sorts. She'll be our first presenter. Jessie Trimble, who's effectively a junior, is an English major with a very strong interest in biology, which makes her by definition an unusual person. She's unusually sweet and kind and also very intellectually able. And so she's fusing her interests together tonight in terms of cognitive decline, the broader area of dementia, and how that affects the treatment of the geriatric patient. And finally, tonight we have one of our elementary ed majors, Chloe Sneed from the great state of Alabama, and she'll be speaking to us about the fundamental needs of students and the role of parents, and if there's any substitute for that, which I would guess that there's not. But if there is, Chloe, let me know. I did all that work with my kids for nothing, I suppose. And so 3 good presentations. Again, as you need to come and go, I'd ask you to wait until they're finished. It should be about 45 minutes per presentation, given their presentation and the questions, and we'll ask for questions from the audience as well. But again, until we get to that point, thank you very much for being here. I know time is very valuable, and I appreciate your support of these students and of the program. So, Chloe, why don't you come on forward and get us started.
Thank you. I would like to echo Dr. Crispell's thanks. Thank you all for being here tonight. I know a lot of you probably have more interesting places you could be, but I appreciate your willingness to support us tonight in our academic endeavors. And I'm especially glad to have the opportunity to speak to you tonight because I actually have a mystery that I need your help solving. This is my family. I love them a lot, but the problem is that these 3 all share a phone, my mom's phone, and they all often text me from the same phone, but they don't actually identify themselves. They don't tell me who's texting me. And often in the case of my brother, they're actually trying to trick me into thinking that there's someone else. So as a result, I've gotten pretty good, I think, at telling them apart from each other. If you take these 3 texts, for example, they're all from the same phone, but I know that they're from 3 different people. And even though they all convey relatively the same content, acknowledgement of a message received and expression of gratitude, the way that each of my family members communicates, and they chose to communicate that message, actually gives me a lot of information about the person that sent it. Take this first text, for example. Notice the punctuation. This is a complete sentence. This is a person who takes their grammar seriously, even when texting. Also notice the period at the end of the text. That is significant. This is a person who might not be super up to date with the texting etiquette that all the teens use these days. This text is short and to the point. This person likes to get in, get out with their communication. Note the spelling difference in okay versus okay. This is distinctly less formal. Also, no punctuation. And note the generic yellow thumbs up. All right, last one. Once again, no capitalization or punctuation, which in this case is very telling. The fingerprint on this text message is the way that this person chose to use an old-fashioned smiley face rather than a stylized emoji. All of these things together, in case you can't tell, scream teenage girl. So this one is definitely my sister, Olivia. This one is Isaac, and this one is my mother. Case closed. Thank you all for your help. Actually, though, even though this is a pretty silly example, the reason that I wanted to start with this is to show to you all that this is the kind of judgment and reasoning that we use in our everyday lives. It's like when you meet someone from the South and you can tell where they're from based off of their regional accent, we kind of instinctively recognize the communication accent of people we engage with on a regular basis, right? That's why we have this phrase, that didn't sound like you. And so I started my research for this project with these questions in mind. How much of ourselves do we reveal through the words that we use to communicate? Because we know that communication through language is very regularly a means of self-expression. But our understanding of that self-expression focuses almost entirely on the content that is being communicated and sometimes the manner in which it is communicated. What we don't consider quite as much as we should is that anonymous words, even when separated from content and matter, could still end up being used to identify the person who created them. So this is our research question for tonight. What about our personalities and identities is conveyed in the actual words that we choose to communicate with, often without much consideration at all? And the search for an answer to this question led me to the field of linguistics, specifically applied linguistics. Now, before beginning my research, I had no idea that the field of linguistics was so broad. And as it turns out, there are multiple answers to my question, or rather multiple compatible facets of the same answer. From the field of psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics, computational linguistics, and more. So if anything I mentioned tonight sparks your interest, there is so much more out there, and I would highly encourage you to look into it if you're ever bored. But what I found was that all of these different fields were kind of founded on this shared principle, this common idea of a linguistic fingerprint. And so that's what I want to talk to you about tonight, this idea of a linguistic fingerprint. What do they look like? What are they made up of? How do we find them? And then we'll use this field of forensic linguistics as a kind of case study to talk about how linguistic fingerprints can be applied specifically in cases of authorship identification. All right, so our story begins in the late 90s. Technology is advancing exponentially overnight, and right around this time, although not many people are paying attention to them, the field of linguistics is experiencing a revolution. Computational linguistic analysis was changing the game. To give you some context, before computerized analysis, it would take hours for linguists to count and categorize just a few paragraphs by hand. It took 3 years for 2 mathematicians to finally determine in 1962 whether Alexander Hamilton or James Madison had written the 12 unclaimed Federalist Papers. But in 1993, Dr. James Pennebaker and his colleagues at the University of Texas created a computer program called Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, known as LIWC. Instead of hours or years, LIWC and other analysis programs that have since been developed can analyze thousands of digital files in just a few seconds. Plus, paired with the explosion of the internet and of social media, these programs now have access to millions of digitized communication data points. In 2013, it took a journalist just a couple hours to identify J.K. Rowling as the author of Harry Potter as the pseudonymous author Robert Galbraith. Now you might be thinking, well, that's great for the linguists and all, but what's the big deal about counting words? Well, this method of computational literary analysis is known as stillimetry, and it uses statistical analysis of written language to identify subtle patterns in language use that a casual reader simply wouldn't pick up on. For example, when it came down to telling the difference between Hamilton and Madison, it was mostly a question of on versus upon, and while versus whilst. And in case you were wondering, the statistics say the anonymous author was Madison. When analyzed as a whole, even small word choices can paint an image of an individual's native language and dialect, speech patterns, vocabulary, and speaking style. And this is where the idea of a linguistic fingerprint comes from. To those who know what to look for, we give ourselves away every time we open our mouths or pick up a pen, just like fingerprints left at a crime scene. The idea behind LIWC specifically was that by counting words and sorting them into psychological categories, linguists could gain insight into people's emotional states through the words that they used. And as Pennebaker and his colleagues began to compare data sets, recurring word patterns kept showing up. As it turns out, our linguistic fingerprints are made up of more than just the mechanics of how we were taught and influenced to use language. They found differences in the way that men and women used words, introverts and extroverts, young and old, upper class and lower class, and the list goes on and on. Eventually, Pennebaker found that word use was associated with almost every aspect of social psychology that he studied. He published a book in 2011, which I have here, and I've pulled an example from its pages to hopefully highlight to you all how this works exactly. This is a thematic apperception test picture. It's a pretty well-known psychological test. The pictures are intentionally vague so that in describing them, patients reveal things about their own emotions and mental processes. So if you have your phone or a notebook, take about 30 seconds to write down your description of this image. You would normally have longer, but we don't really have time for that right now. So, who are these people? What is happening? What are their thoughts, emotions, feelings? How would you describe this image to someone who couldn't see it? Feel free to keep writing as I explain. But thousands of people have written about this picture, and the stories that they create range very widely. Here are 3 examples from college students that Pennebaker interviewed. They're pretty similar content-wise. They all see an old woman and a young woman. But look more closely at each person's writing. Can you get a good sense of the kind of person that each one is? Who would be the most fun to get coffee with? Who would you trust the most to borrow notes from for a test? Even in these brief sentences, I think we can get a pretty good idea of who these people are. The first person seems like they take themselves pretty seriously, like they intentionally use big words to come across as authoritative or intelligent. The second one has a much more personal, warmer touch. The third person sounds more casual than the other two and seems to maybe not be taking the assignment quite as seriously. We might even be able to make educated guesses about these people. We can do a reasonably good job in predicting that person one is a male and the other two are females. He probably has a higher grade average than the other two, although his social life might be suffering. Person two is the one most likely to be depressed. Person three is probably not doing well in school. They might be spending too much time with friends. Now, at this point, you might be feeling rather skeptical, but these are more than educated guesses. They are based on evidence that the words people use in their daily lives can tell us a great deal about who they are. Words leave behind clues of a person. It all goes back to our research question, remember? How much of ourselves do we reveal through the actual words that we use to communicate? The secret is in distinguishing between what people are saying versus how they are saying, content versus style. Let's take a moment and see what would happen if we were to take these writing samples and keep only the content words, the nouns, action verbs, and significant modifiers. With just these words, you still have a pretty good idea of what's going on, but you lose most of the distinguishing factors that separate one person from the other. If we were to do the inverse and retain only style words, we would lose all sense of what they're talking about. But these function words are where the soul of personality lies. The short, unobtrusive words like pronouns, prepositions, and articles make up 55% of all of the words we use on a daily basis. We don't really think about them very much, which makes them hard for us to perceive in others and to control in ourselves, which makes them a surprisingly effective mirror. And as I'm sure you can imagine, having a surprisingly accurate reflection of the author of a given text is extremely helpful in a variety of scenarios. So as I promised, tonight I would like to take a quick look at modern forensic linguistics and how we can use linguistic fingerprints in authorship attribution, just to give you a small taste of how powerful these fingerprints truly can be. Modern forensic linguistics are the study of language and its application in legal settings. It involves the analysis of written and spoken language, often to determine, like I said, the authorship of a text, the credibility of a witness, or the intent of a speaker. The field has grown significantly in the past couple years, and forensic linguistics are more commonly called as expert witnesses, have been more increasingly called as expert witnesses in the past couple years. One of the most common applications of forensic linguistics is authorship attribution. By analyzing the vocabulary, syntax, and style of a text, forensic linguistics can develop a profile of the type of person who might have written it. This can be helpful in criminal investigations, for example, when authorities need to identify the author of a threatening or incriminating letter. Computational linguistic analysis can help to identify patterns of language use across text that are unique to a particular author or group of authors, and can even be used to identify individuals who attempt to conceal their identity. Authorship attribution has also been used to solve non-criminal mysteries, such as identifying pseudonymous writing, as we talked about earlier, or uncovering anonymous authors that have been lost to history. A subset of authorship attribution that I was particularly interested in is where stellimetry is gaining attention is in the field of cybersecurity. With the growth of social media and online communication, there is a growing need to identify the authors of anonymous online posts and detect cybercrime. Various proposals have been made to use computational linguistics to flag fake news, detect deep fakes, and even to address recent concerns surrounding students who plagiarize using AI human language models, such as ChatGPT. Now, before we wrap up here, I would like to issue a quick disclaimer. In some ways, the name linguistic fingerprint is a bit of a misnomer. As we all recognize, fingerprints are extremely unique. No two fingerprints are exactly alike. And while it's true that individuals have a distinctive way of writing and speaking, it would be inaccurate to say that there are completely infallible, wholly automatic ways of identifying a certain author or speaker out of a crowd of people. There have been some pretty tragic cases of people being wrongly convicted or publicly slandered because of linguists who relied too heavily on their own analysis of a situation. But at the same time, linguistic analysis is an incredibly fast-growing field that is being steadily refined by modern practices and capabilities. And just like every other piece of evidence in a court case, whether it be DNA or witness testimony, forensic linguistics provide just another piece in the puzzle of who might be responsible. As I've already mentioned a couple times, this paper and this presentation has barely scratched the surface of what forensic linguistics and linguistic fingerprints are composed of and how they can be applied to real life. But even so, I think we have seen tonight that the analysis of our words and language use can yield startlingly specific results about the type of person that generated them. As the reliability and accessibility of stelimetry and computational linguistics grows, the relevance of linguistic fingerprints has the potential to shape the future of our courtrooms. Yet, despite the fact that these are relatively modern capabilities, it should not be surprising to us as Christians that our words reveal our hearts. After all, in Matthew 12:34, Jesus tells the people, "Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." Thank you for your time.
Sorry. This is more of a comment, but in teaching writing to children this semester, your topic, I feel like, has a lot of connections to that because one of the things that we work on developing is their author's voice, which in my opinion is one of the hardest things to teach because it's something that's so innate, like you were explaining in your presentation. Each person has their own voice when they write, and sometimes it can be difficult for children or beginning writers to discover that voice. A lot of times writing is very like formulaic and like choppy. And when it comes down to it, I feel like most of the suggestions for developing voice just involve reading more and writing more because the only way you're going to improve it is by just practicing it because you're not going to be, copying somebody else. It's really inside of you and you just have to work to kind of bring it out. So It's very like abstract and is difficult to teach, but your presentation really was just making me think about that and how every person really does have their own voice and just thinking about how we can help them realize that. Yeah.
That's really cool. Thank you. I hadn't made that connection. That's really cool.
Yeah, not really a question, but, kind of. Do you think that your linguistic fingerprint can, change over time? Like, say you're 20 years old and you get caught for something, whatever, but then there's no trial or no, examination of evidence until, 20 years later. Would that kind of change? I
Yeah,
don't know.
definitely. And that's part of the issue behind using these as, cold, hard facts, is that your linguistic fingerprint definitely does change over time and even changes across, if you're writing an essay versus if you're sending a text. So that's definitely a valid observation.
Mine was kind of going along with what Macy said, but how this could be used by teachers to catch cheating and plagiarism and stuff, because I feel like teachers can always tell when it's not someone's writing or something, you can tell by your word choice, and just how this could really be used if in teaching they studied that and stuff to be able to tell kids apart in how they write.
That would be really cool. I definitely don't think that's a thing currently, but yeah.
It sounds like someone feels guilty. I'm not sure. And then I've got a 20-year-old that might commit a crime and then grow older. But it is true, our voices change over time.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a way to account for that?
Not yet, no.
Okay. Yeah, just wondered about that.
Yeah. typically linguistic fingerprints are used in crime cases on like a case-by-case basis, and most of the issues with using forensic linguistics have been when linguists have tried to use, writing examples from 10 years ago to apply for a crime that was committed yesterday, and it just doesn't work, and it ends up in just more confusion than necessary.
Your presentation was really great, by the way.
Thank you.
Something when you were talking, because I'm in 2 different classes that kind of go into Pauline epistles. One's Thessalonians and Philippians, and the other's 1 Corinthians. And like something we talk about is like attributing authorship, especially with Paul, like throughout different books of the Bible. So it just made me think of that because we look so much at style and that kind of thing. I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah,
So.
I actually found a couple articles talking about like using this kind of research and applying it to the Bible. I don't think they had very much success, but I thought it was very entertaining to read.
So I did my presentation on AI a couple weeks ago, and you mentioned it briefly in the way that people have started to use linguistics to catch people cheating using AI, that kind of thing. I guess my question would be like the flip side of that, like as people continue to use AI to write things, are those linguistic, do you think those fingerprints are going to start to go away and everything's going to start to be more, I don't know, streamlined, I guess, and that's going to be harder to tell when someone's writing it or when they're having a computer do it for them?
Yeah, that's definitely a valid question. And that's actually something that one of the books that I read raised about this idea of like, do we even have fingerprints that are unique to ourselves? Because we are all educated in very standardized environments. And so even though like we're all from different places across the US, like we're probably taught to write and to read in pretty similar ways. And so that's definitely like a valid concern. But I think even the fact that we can still observe these distinguished differences between people and their writing styles, even when we can see that we have a standardized pattern of education and other things. I'm not sure how much of an issue that will be, but I think it's probably less than some people are afraid it will be.
What Seth brought up, though, is going to be a salient question continuing forward from this point. So would it be fair to say, too, that if you have computer-generated writing, that a regular person's writing is going to stand out more, that your author's voice is going to be that much stronger because it isn't, been conditioned by some machine and
Right.
an essay spit out. That's
Yeah.
probably going to be
Yeah,
the
I think
case.
that's valid. I think even though, like, we can see, I have the most experience working with, like, ChatGPT, but I think we can see even though it's very good at spitting out information and it's very clever, its writing is not very good. Like, I don't think any student would turn in an essay. Well, I could be wrong, but I would not be very proud to turn in an essay that was written by an AI robot.
Because you're Claire. But there are others who would be very glad to turn it in and just be done with it. But that is going to be a question moving forward, and it may be a way to identify people that much quicker. So we'll just see. And of course, over time, too, the cognitive decline we're going to get to, people's writing will probably erode over time, I would guess, with most people, especially in extreme cases. And so, there's limits to this, but still, there are unique features about what we say. It's hard to be anonymous when you write. So, Yuritsa?
Hi, I was just wondering if you knew, do you think it'd be possible for someone to like disguise their linguistic fingerprint?
Yes, that's probably the top concern in the field right now, is as they start to standardize and kind of publicize this ability of, like if I were to put out a computer program that could analyze a text and tell me things about the person who's writing it, if I publicize that, well then now people also have access to that to kind of work behind the scenes and mess up their text so that I can't tell things about it. So that's definitely a valid concern in the field right now.
Hey, I also thought your presentation was fantastic and I enjoyed listening to you. I had something similar to what Paige just kind of rang. You could, like sometimes we read through part of a letter and without even looking at the top, we're like, oh, that's Paul, okay. And then that's been just seeing those things. Question, with some of the things that were mentioned earlier about teachers being able to tell after a while, that's this student, and moms are able to tell this kid said this kid said this. What are some of the specific things that linguists look for whenever it's someone that they have no connection to whatsoever? What are telltale signs of
Yeah.
different kinds of personality?
So that's really where the computers come in, is up until kind of the telemetry capabilities of the 21st century. A lot of this was just kind of expert opinion, comparing known text to the text in question. But now that we're able to kind of have this statistical analysis of text, now we're able to have more of an objective coming in without any knowledge of the situation and still being able to learn things about the text. But it's still, like I mentioned, like it's not as if I could give you a paragraph and you could tell me who out here wrote it, but you might be able to say, okay, well, we know that a man over 40 wrote this, or something like that. Or it's not even we know in Boyle. There's a 75% chance that a woman under 17 wrote this, kind of thing.
So outside of like the forensic realm, I was wondering, you'd mentioned the Unabomber, and of course he was an abnormal psychological case, but if people were struggling with mental health, could linguistic forensics be able to study this, or like be able to find people that are in need of mental health?
Yeah, okay, so that's actually something that I didn't get to talk about at all in my paper or in my presentation. But the idea of using psycholinguistics to diagnose people who have depression is actually something that James Pennebaker is like a really strong advocate for. And he's used it even in people who have a terminal cancer diagnosis, using this kind of linguistic therapy to encourage them to write in ways about their diagnosis that improves their mental outlook on life. And it's kind of complicated. I didn't have time to explain it, but that's definitely a thing. And it's really cool how much we can know about not just, oh, you're a man, but also, like, Todd, are you doing okay? Like, you use some really depressive words in your social media over the past year. Things like that are like pretty new capabilities that I think are really cool.
First of all, just well done. I really enjoyed your paper. I know you focused on forensic linguistics, and I guess you just answered my question when you answered Todd's question, but do you think linguistics could be used in other fields of work as well, rather than just forensics or just catching people cheating, I guess?
Oh, yeah. That's part of the issue I had with kind of narrowing down what to talk about tonight, is that pretty much anywhere where you can use words, you can use linguistic fingerprints. And that's, I mean, like, it's kind of overwhelming even to think about if this is valid, and that's kind of the issue right now, is proving that the science is, like, consistent and reliable. But if we can prove that this is a consistent, reliable thing, then yeah, we could use it pretty much anywhere we use words.
Which flies in the face of some opinions today that you can choose identities and decide what you're going to be. Your linguistics may give you away, right, regardless. And so it's interesting, there's some things that may be innate or tied to our upbringing or our culture or what have you that we cannot get away from, try as we might. So that's a whole nother aspect. Questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
This isn't necessarily a question, but when I'm grading papers over a period of time, and after I've had like several papers that are written by a particular individual, like in class, that have been turned in, and then when something else comes in later, it's like, it's something that is triggered. You know, there have been times where most of the time I'll write something or grade something, not paying attention to what the name is. I do that on purpose. But after I've been reading for a while, I know who it is, just because I know who the individual is. Communication classes, you get to know your students. But there will be a time where I'll be reading something and I'll go, I have no idea who this is. And I haven't seen writing like this. Gee, this looks like someone who has a background in public relations wrote this. And I will Google that, do an advanced Google, and every single time it's been somebody who just lifted stuff off a website and plunked it in. not citing a source.
Yeah.
So I mean, just from years of doing it and knowing your students, you can see a huge shift if you're used to what their real writing is first. But if you don't, if they turn stuff in all the time that would be chosen from different places, you wouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah, yeah, and that's, I think, I said it in answer to someone, talking about how a lot of times you have to have a legitimate example first before you can figure out, is this person connected or not? But yeah, I think that's actually really cool that you're kind of proving my thesis.
Yeah, we try to warn students that, no offense, but the difference between undergraduate writing, even at your level, and a professional's is like from here to the moon.
Mm-hmm.
And so don't try to plagiarize. It won't work. And people will try anyway. And now they'll use ChatGPT, but that doesn't give you citations, and so they'll get caught anyway. Other questions, comments? Yes, ma'am.
What Macy was saying about in the classroom really got me thinking, because we spend a lot of time with our students, and so I've noticed that like some of the things that I say have worked their way into my kids' vocabulary. Like I say, like for real all the time when I talk to them. The other day, one of them like answered my question and was like, yeah, for real. And I hadn't even said for real in that sentence, and I was like, well, maybe I need to like change it up sometimes, say something different so that they don't start going home talking exactly the way that I do. Because that just got me thinking, like, have they done studies on how much of our vocabulary and like linguistic footprint comes from the people around us, not like ourselves?
I tried to find some research on that. The best I could find was kind of like an opinion article talking about how, it's like exactly what you said, how when we spend time around other people, we pick up words from people that we admire, and we give words to people who admire us, and how sometimes we feel kind of possessive of words that are ours. But if it's being used by someone we admire, then, oh, well, they can have it. And things like that are very interesting, kind of the interplay of like how we are very social creatures and also use language. Yeah, that's very, very interesting.
Have any of you gone home and your parents say, where'd you learn to say things like that? Or why do you say y'all when you're from New Jersey? Or anything like that? Yeah, it happens. It happens, and teachers have a huge impact on their students that way. Anything else? Tom?
Excellent, Claire. My concern is, imagine a totalitarian government that assigns people a social credit score. And it's going to be based on things like what books you read. We've already heard rumors of report out of Britain that if you read Lord of the Rings or C.S. Lewis, you're more likely to be a right-wing extremist. Something like this could be used to analyze your social media communication and determine if you're not patriotic enough or you're too patriotic or whatever the agenda is. I was just curious whether you ran across anything that raised those particular concerns of a kind of a dark underside misuse intentionally or something like that.
That's interesting. I had not. I didn't really look into that at all. I would say the closest that I came was finding examples of how forensic linguistics had been misused in the court system to, people with good intentions accidentally put people in jail who didn't belong there. And so that's probably the closest that I came. I would say at this point, the field is still transitioning from a kind of a field of expert testimony in the courtroom to a field of like quantifiable statistic analysis in the courtroom. And so until that transition is complete, I don't really think there's much to worry about. Just because, we still have DNA and we still have actual fingerprints and things that are much more weighty. In comparison, linguistic fingerprints are not nearly as weighty. So I don't know if that answers your question. But
Dr. Amos?
As everyone has said, very good job, just reiterate that. But are you seeing more studies done basically with how people write and looking at their writing, or is there also dealing with pronunciation? Because I know when I was in college, I was out with people from Pennsylvania, so my language changed throughout the year. Not necessarily the words, but how I said the words.
I didn't really look into that very much in my research. It's definitely valid. I just kind of went in with the assumption, like, oh, well, we already know that there are these regional differences, accents. But I was looking more at specific word use. But yeah, I think that's definitely a valid observation. There are so many tiny little regional differences, not even in like what you would hear necessarily, like a southern accent. But the fact that I'm from Indiana and I still say y'all probably points to the fact that there are a lot of people from the South in my home congregation, and I picked up on it from them. So yeah, that's interesting to think about.
We just thought you were cool.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Jesse?
I think Dr. Amos kind of just touched on this, but with what she was saying and what you were saying, it reminded me of in the realism literary period, you had a lot of authors that were trying to make things as real as possible, and one of the writing styles they would use was called regionalism, in which they would purposely mimic slang and terms that were used in certain areas, such like Mark Twain. I think the most famous is Mark Twain because he had a short story called The Jumping Frog of Caladagas County or something, and all the characters in there used phrasing, and he like minced words to make it sound like they were from that area. And yeah, so I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I never really liked reading Huck Finn as a kid because I struggled to read that way that he would write in that regional accent. I was always like, it's like bad grammar. I can't read it. I don't understand what he's saying. But I don't know, maybe that says something about who I am.
Okay, you're not cool.
Not anymore. I like it now.
Anything else from the audience? But from the panel. Yuritsa, anything else?
You didn't mention it here in your presentation, but I did want you to maybe tell everybody about the origin that you said in your paper about it. I thought that was really cool.
Yes, all of my Bible faculty in the audience will appreciate this. I included a brief quotation from the man who is considered to be the father of forensic linguistics. His name is Roger Shy. He's still alive. He's 92 years old, lives in Montana. But I found an interview with him where he said that the origins of forensic linguistics can be traced back to the Old Testament in Judges 12, where the men of Gilead identify their enemies, the Ephraimites, by asking them to pronounce the Hebrew word shibboleth, and if they pronounced it incorrectly as Sibboleth, they were killed. And there were about 42,000 Ephraimites who were caught and executed. And so I thought that was just kind of amusing that these are the origins of forensic linguistics.
Yeah, I kind of going back to like when we were talking about the AI and the way that the AI writes. When I did my presentation a couple weeks ago, and I did my intro, my intro was something that ChatGPT had written. And one of the issues I had with it when I was trying to figure out how to make my presentation flow is it didn't sound like me. Like I read it and I spoke it, but it didn't sound like anything else I was going to say. And I knew that anybody in the audience who had heard me speak before was going to know that I was doing something weird because it didn't sound like me. And so like that, it's so interesting to me that, even if you can put as many like qualifiers into that prompt for that computer as you want to, but ultimately, kind of like to tie your presentation and mine together, like you can't replace the personal touch of human speech with a computer. You just can't. So.
Which I find rather comforting. I don't know.
I was just wondering, in your research, did you find anything about like mix-ups between family members when they're doing this? Because like I'm sitting by my sister, and we went to the same schools, we have the same parents, and we heard the same things, and so I think we speak similarly and type very similarly, and we're also only 2 years apart, so it'd probably fall in the same thing, but like, have they had mix-ups? Because I know we do type different, but can they pick that stuff up? Or I don't know if that was in your research.
That is interesting. No, I didn't do very much research about that, I don't think. I have a similar situation. My sister Kate is here. You probably saw her in the picture. She's like a year and a half younger than I am. We were homeschooled together, and now we're both here at FC. And I think it's interesting that even though we sound similar and talk similar, our writing styles are actually pretty different. And I don't know if that's true for you two. But I don't know what that says about like kind of the translation from thought to writing to versus to speech. But yeah, that's an interesting thought.
Mine was just another comment, but I was just going to say how you were talking about Judges 12, the Sibboleth, how people from Louisville, Kentucky, like if you say Louisville, they can tell that you're not from there, and they'll kind of like rip on you for it if you're like, oh, you're from Louisville? What is that? So I was just going to make that comment.
Yeah, that's a good comparison.
I was just wondering if if your fingerprint can kind of change based on who you're talking to. When you put up the slide of all the different texts that your brother, your sister, and your mom sent you, I was just kind of thinking like, okay, I would send the first one to my mom, and I would send the second one to my brother, and then send the third one to someone else. Like,
yeah.
Maybe that's just me changing the way I speak based on who I'm around, but
Yeah.
I don't know. Does it depend on who you're talking to or what you're writing?
That's a good question. I think the main issue with the examples that I put up on the screen is that they're entirely too small. And so while it might be true that you change certain aspects of how you talk from person to person, if we have a large enough sample size of you talking to all of your friends and all of your family members, then we have a more reliable picture of how you talk overall. But yeah, I'm sure that there's a certain amount of variation, even from person to person or context to context, text, email, different things like that.
I saw that one thing that James Pennebaker had said was your use of pronouns reveals your personality, and I thought that was very interesting, just because, one, I forgot to say you did an excellent job on your presentation, but two, me and my siblings are all insanely different, and I think it's very funny because if you analyze, like you're saying, our text messages, how we talk to each other, how we talk to our parents, or then like to people outside the family, it is just like, it's very different, but it does say, like, just this example, just really like messed with my mind because I'm like, we're all very different, and it's definitely based on our personality in some way.
Very cool.
I was just wondering that, do you think linguists can pinpoint accents based on people's writings? Because I know that when I speak, I have an accent, but when I'm like writing an essay or something, it doesn't come across the same way. So I'm just wondering if you can like pick up on people's accents for where they're from.
That's a good question. I think it probably comes down to more regional terms and more like dialect. I don't know are there words that you typically use in your everyday life that you noticed are like distinctly different from maybe your roommates?
Yes, yeah.
So it's probably would come across more in words like that. Or even in references it gets more into like the context of where you're from, not in how you sound necessarily, but in what you say.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. And now I'm going to be hypersensitive about how I write for a while. Our second presenter, Jesse Trimble, will be speaking to us now about something somewhat depressing, mental decline, right? Cognitive decline and dementia, but a very real thing as people struggle with how to best treat geriatric patients and how to deal with things as they decline in terms of mental ability. So come on forward, Jesse.
Good evening. Last semester, I spoke about the growing geriatric population and the decline of geriatric doctors. But tonight, I would like to speak about another rising concern in the geriatric population, dementia and cognitive decline. In 1901, a 50-year-old woman named Auguste Dieter began to exhibit abnormal symptoms. She was having problems sleeping, memory loss, confusion, paranoia, and varying mood shift. It is noted that all of these symptoms progressed quickly and violently. She was taken to the Frankfurt Psychiatric Hospital, where she was admitted and would remain until her death 5 years later, in 1906, when Dr. Alois Alzheimer would examine her brain post-mortem and change the world with his research. The patient, Auguste Dieter, is the first officially recorded case of dementia in history. Currently, the total of new cases every year is about 7.7 million worldwide. It has also been recorded by the World Health Organization that in 2010, there were 35.6 million dementia cases worldwide. But this number is expected to double every 20 years. This means that by the year 2030, there will be 65.7 million cases, and by the year 2050, there will be 115.4 million cases of dementia worldwide. However, we must first consider the question, what is dementia? The Alzheimer's Association is a corporation devoted to spreading awareness about dementia and funding research to stop cognitive decline. This association defines dementia as a general term for the loss of memory, language, problem solving, and other thinking abilities that are severe enough to affect daily life. The term dementia has become an umbrella for many different disorders and diseases that develop as you age and are caused by abnormal brain changes. These brain changes are classified by damage to the brain cells, which causes miscommunication and causes the cells to be unable to carry out basic duties. This damage can cause severe shrinking of brain mass and cell death, and it is important to recognize that the development of dementia is not a typical part of aging. Dementia is not a natural progression of age and therefore should not be expected in every geriatric patient. Caroline Harada, a geriatric researcher, Dr. Marissa C. Nadelson-Love, a resident physician in the Department of Neurology at the University of Alabama, and Kristen Treble, an assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at the University of Alabama, performed a study on normal cognitive aging. They discovered that the retrieval of information without being prompted, knowing where information on specific subjects is obtained, and the ability to remember to perform certain tasks does decline in aging. However, they also discovered that the ability to answer questions when prompted, memories relating to time and events, and the memory of how to perform certain tasks remained. The Alzheimer's Association emphasizes that there are 10 signs of dementia that can identify abnormal cognitive decline in loved ones. The 10 signs are memory loss that affects everyday life, challenges when making plans, solving problems and using numbers, difficulty completing everyday tasks, confusion with the passing of time, difficulty with balance, problems with words and speech, misplacing objects and then unable to retrace your steps to find them, poor decision-making, withdrawal from family, and changes in mood. However, it is important to recognize again that some cognitive decline is natural with age, and only severe symptoms in these categories should be considered dangerous. For example, someone who forgets to pay a bill 1 or 2 times should not be given a dementia diagnosis. It is the pattern of continued forgetfulness that should raise a red flag. The Mayo Clinic, the #1 hospital in the nation, highlights several risk factors that could lead to dementia, such as diet, exercise, alcohol intake, depression, cardiovascular problems, smoking, sleeping problems, and head trauma. However, this clinic emphasizes that age, family history, and Down syndrome are risk factors that cannot be changed. Different types of dementia are associated with different areas of brain damage. For example, dementia with Lewy bodies first affects the cerebral cortex, which controls perception, thought, and language. There are 5 major types of dementia: Alzheimer's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, frontotemporal dementia, vascular dementia, and mixed dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the biggest of these, affecting about 60 to 80% of all cases in the United States. And it's usually diagnosed in people 65 years and older. And just to recap from my presentation last semester, 65 years and older, you are considered a geriatric patient. In Alzheimer's disease, 2 structures, plaque, which is a beta amyloid protein, and tangles, which are twisted fibers called tau, build up inside the nerve cells and in the spaces between nerve cells to block communication and disrupt processes that cells need to survive. These begin to develop in parts of the brain that affect learning and then move to cause disorientation, suspicion, difficulty eating, difficulty with movement, and difficulty speaking. When someone is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, the life expectancy is 4 to 8 years. Vascular dementia is the second most prominent form of dementia that occurs because of blockage of blood flow. This causes inadequate amounts of nutrients and oxygen to reach the cells, which in turn die. Vascular dementia causes confusion, disorientation, and inability to speak. This type is usually connected directly with stroke, and patients diagnosed with this usually survive about 3 years. Dementia with Lewy bodies is the third most common. This causes abnormal, balloon-like clumps of protein to be produced within the brain that clog cognitive processes, much like Alzheimer's. This type of dementia causes hallucinations, sleeping problems, movement problems, and physical distortions such as hunching over and tremors. Frontotemporal dementia is the 4th most common type, affecting about 50,000 to 60,000 people in the United States. It is so named because it affects the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain and therefore causes a loss of function in these areas. This can make the patient lose the capacity to plan, process auditory info, and create new memories. The symptoms can appear as early as mid-20s, but is diagnosed more commonly in 40 to 60-year-old patients. This dementia has been proven to be inherited, as has Alzheimer's. The 5th most common is mixed dementia, and it is a combination of several different dementias. The most common being a combination of vascular dementia and Alzheimer's due to the amount of stroke patients in the United States. There are other types of dementia that can be linked to genetic inheritance, but the 5 described here are most prominent. However, now that the main 5 have been identified, it begs the question, what can be done? Let us first examine what can and has been done worldwide. In 2017, the World Health Organization developed and launched a global monitoring system that tracks and records and records the treatments and plans created for people who have dementia and for people who are caring for them. 21 countries were surveyed, and the results proved that over 81% have raised awareness for dementia, over 70% have created wellness plans, over 70% are providing support and classes for carers, and over 65% have dementia-friendly plans in place. The World Health Organization believes that to counter the growing amount of people in the world with dementia today, there needs to be a wide public health initiative. Second, it is important to recognize what plans should be developed by physicians. Physicians should be ready to create helpful plans that cater to their patients' strengths and weaknesses while balancing the delicate nature of the patient's infirmities. Last semester, I emphasized that all geriatric physicians must be willing to create plans pertaining to the 5 M's: mind, mobility, medication, multi-complexity, and matters most. All of these must be considered by a physician when answering the question, where do we go from here? Although there has not been a proven cure for dementia, the Mayo Clinic does recommend several steps that can be beneficial to postponing cognitive decline. These include stimulating brain games, physical activity, social activity, maintaining a regular sleep schedule, eating healthy, and managing cardiovascular risk factors. The Alzheimer's Association also emphasizes that there is no cure for dementia. Rather, there are several treatments that can stabilize symptoms, but not long-term. Finally, it is most important to recognize the strain of a dementia diagnosis on the individual and their loved ones. This diagnosis can be isolating, frustrating, and can make patients feel hopeless due to lack of treatment options. However, as Christians, we should not let this hopelessness pull us away from God. During Lectures Week, I had the opportunity to attend a lecture on the subject of ancient lies told to modern Christians. One of these lies is, because you are a Christian and worship God, nothing bad will ever happen to you. I think that there are several books in the Bible that would disagree with that statement. But when bad things happen in your life, it does not mean that God loves you any less. People do not develop illnesses or sicknesses because God is punishing them, and no one should have to carry the burden of physical illness alone. In Galatians 6:2, Christians are commanded to bear one another's burdens. Christians must be willing to help those in need and care for one another so no one feels alone. Because when we are alone, the struggles of this world can overwhelm us. We need to unify when the struggles of this world threaten to drag us under. And that is not just reserved for fellow Christians. We are to help everyone in need. When physical maladies begin to frustrate us, we must remember that we are not meant to live forever, and there is an incorruptible future that we must all strive for. But with the projected number of dementia patients growing at an alarming rate, it is important to ask, why does this matter? Why am I standing here on a Tuesday night at 6 o'clock talking to you all about dementia? It matters because you will know someone who has dementia, whether it be a beloved family member, a friend, or yourself. In 2017, the Alzheimer's Association did a survey of adult family caregivers who care for someone who has Alzheimer's or another type of dementia. They discovered that there were 15.7 million people in the United States that were caring for someone with dementia. In 1 Peter 5:7, we are told to cast all our anxiety on him because he cares for you. It can be discouraging to watch the people you love begin to decline physically and mentally, but God is always ready to hear your frustrations and answer them. Dementia is not a normal part of aging and should not be treated as such. It is a destructive disease that must be taken seriously. And with technological advances and thorough research, we will hopefully be better equipped to lessen its devastating effects on society, on family, and on the individual. Thank you.
First of all, I really appreciate the way that you ended that in here's this horrible thing that's in the world, but we have hope for that. Well done with that. Definitely hits home for me. My great-grandmother had Alzheimer's. My grandmother had dementia. So I was just kind of follow-up question. You mentioned it being genetic and family history. In some of those cases, diet probably played a part, but I was wondering, what are some of the things that they look for genetically, or can they even tell genetically yet they just see a pattern? What's kind of involved in that?
Well, the Alzheimer's disease has been proven to be a gene that can be tracked on chromosomes. And the vascular dementia The reason why it has a genetic issue is because vascular dementia is directly linked with stroke. So families that have a history of cardiovascular problems are more likely to develop vascular dementia because of that.
Again, thank you for your presentation. That was really good. This is a subject, kind of with Jordan, it's something that hits close to home. And I noticed that you talked about sleep, and that's I'm reading a book right now by Matthew Walker, and he talks about how deep sleep and having proper sleep cycles helps prevent dementia, Alzheimer's, things like that. And so most of my main question is, did you see anything in your research that talks about sleep, how it protects against, it says cancer, and even what ends up happening with Alzheimer's as well?
I didn't look too much into the sleep aspect when we're looking at people who are affected. I know that being sleepless is something that we all struggle with at college, but I did not look specifically into that, so I'll have to get back to you.
Well, you talked about countries making wellness plans to help with dementia, and I was just wondering do you think these plans extended life expectancy or gave a better quality of life to the patients?
I think based on the percents that they had in which raising awareness for it, I think that was the main goal of the program itself. And when you raise awareness for it, it destroys any stigmas that might be attached to dementia, which it's horrible when you look those up online. But I think just the percents, which I do not have, they are here somewhere. Okay, well, just the percents of people who now know about it and know it's a problem in the community, I think that helps a lot. And also, I mean, prevention hasn't really been able to be developed completely, so we're looking more at postponement, and the earlier you catch it, the easier it is to sort of postpone it and create a treatment plan. So, yeah.
So with the projected increase in dementia diagnoses over the next 40 years or so that you discussed, is this due to the rise in the population of the elderly, or is it due to an increase in risk factors among population, like a rise in depression or a rise in diet issues, or is it really just unknown why it is projected to increase?
It could also be because we have ways of flagging it now. And, before, obviously, in 1901, they couldn't immediately tell that she had it, and that was like the first case ever. But I think now that we are developing systems, and I think they identify it with MRIs and CTs, and they have several little tests that can be given to a patient orally just to kind of see where they're at. And I think that that's probably why it's rising so much, because now we have the technology able to identify how many people have it, and it's something that wasn't noticed in the past.
At the same time, Macy, you're right. I mean, it's a greatly increasing geriatric population now. The majority of the baby boomer generation is now beyond that point. And so just percentages dictate that you're going to have a much bigger problem. This drives questions of insurance, euthanasia, moral questions of that magnitude. Quality of life was brought up. I mean, so what are we going to be dealing with in the future years is anybody's guess. So postponing the problem is certainly helpful, but we're going to have the problem. It's going to be hopefully not an explosion of cases in the next 10 years.
Yeah, cool. That answered my question. I was going to ask if the rate was actually increasing or if it was just because of the increasing aging population and diagnostic tests and things that we're finding out. But cool. I was wondering, the study that you found that Caroline Harada did, the geriatric researcher, on normal cognitive aging, said something about, it is normal for your cognitive decline or your cognition to decline as you age. How did they define normal?
Oh, okay.
You know, was it like just a study that was done in the United States, or was it like worldwide?
I believe it was done in the United States, and I think it actually did connect with the 10 signs that I mentioned earlier, with the memory loss that affects everyday life. I think it was done on a scale basis, and all the people were asked questions and how they answered them. And I do believe in that study they compared them to a younger population just to see just how different it was. So.
I was wondering if you found in your research our reliance on like technology and our screen time, if that affected why like the cases of dementia are going up, because I would think we're not having to like memorize as much stuff or maybe use our minds as much with our phones and just all of that, if that impacted it at all.
I didn't actually find anything on screen time, but that would be a really interesting project to do, just to see how that causes the degradation.
You touch on something important there, Jenna, because the less active you are mentally, I mean, even in what the Mayo Clinic suggests would be a counter to just stay on your phone or let ChatGPT write all your letters for you, right, if you don't want your own voice anymore. The brain is like, I guess, like a muscle. I'm not a physician, so I don't know. But it certainly appears the more you use it in some ways, you can at least forestall some problems and probably strengthen it in some ways, right? So
you talked about how some symptoms can be noticed as early as your mid-20s, which kind of just freaked me out because like, I'm in my 20s, you know? But why can't they really catch it? Because it said like the symptoms will appear, but it's more diagnosed like in your 40s to 60s. Like, is there just not routine checks at younger ages, or?
I didn't really see anything. I think it was like super rare cases that they found in their 20s, but I didn't see too much about that.
Yeah, so like you said, this hits for a lot of us. There's a lot of us that know people that have had issues with this. There's been this interesting comparison in my family with, my grandmother had Alzheimer's, and the amount of time from diagnosis to her passing was like a year. It was very fast, very quick moving. But her dad, from diagnosis to death, was like 15 years. And so there's always been this, which obviously that's well above average. And so there's always been this interesting like process, like thought process for us about like, you know, maybe they caught hers later and they caught his earlier or whatever. But I guess my question is like, how does the treatment change depending on like how long the disease is going on and how, I guess, healthy the patient was previously, because that could play into it as well.
I think it's all about preventative measures, and I'm sorry, one moment. I'm actually not feeling well all of a sudden. I'm so sorry. I just need a moment.
Step down there. You okay? That's fine. Let's pick up there. You okay? Fortunately, we have 2 or 3 nurses on the floor, so. All right, so Seth, your question about can they catch it earlier, can they do more for it? I think the key was, and Jesse got to this, was there's really no cure for Alzheimer's. I don't know if you remember last time when we had a presentation on the retina, that one of the things they think they can do is maybe diagnose Alzheimer's quicker based on scans of the retina. But that's very controversial at this point. They haven't yet proven that. But people are very concerned about that. How quickly can I catch it? So maybe I can do something to forestall its progression. So, Yuritsa?
I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but I was just wondering.
I'm only 58 and a half, so maybe I can do it.
Jesse mentioned that Down syndrome was a risk factor that you can't change, and I was just wondering why specifically Down syndrome?
I'm not sure.
Thank you.
But I feel very sharp of mind. You know, I say that, and we joke about that, and it's not nothing, you know, it's a serious thing, but that's what we do with these things, isn't it? It's hard to deal with these things. We don't know the outcome of these things. And so, you know, we kind of joke about cognitive decline, but we all face it. So we just all laugh together. Questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
I don't necessarily have a question, but I know
issues when you work with someone who has Alzheimer's. A friend of mine sits with a couple women who have Alzheimer's, and the one woman is always waiting for her husband to come home, who's been dead for 15 years. And my friend Janet is saying to me, Kathleen, I don't want her to keep grieving her husband every single day because she thinks he's alive. So I just lie to her. I just say, he's not home from work yet. Or, he doesn't come home from work until 6 o'clock. And she says, because I hate to tell this woman every single day that her husband is dead. And so there's just all kinds of things that you have to find out what is the compassionate thing to do in this situation, and other people who will argue with the person to try and help them see that what they're thinking is not quite correct. And so that there's a battle constantly going on instead of just allowing them to live in a fairy world where they're calm. So their interpersonal communication skills are often put to the challenge when you're dealing with someone whose mind is not what it used to be.
And that usually comes down to the decisions of every family and every caregiver, and knowing that person and knowing how and having experience with them, what's going to work versus what's not going to work. So you're right. There are questions of an ethical nature that come up. So anything else? Anything else from the panel? Macy, any questions, thoughts? Hand it back down there.
So this is actually directed towards Yuritsa, your question about the relationship between Down syndrome and dementia. I've actually read just a little bit about this, not very much, but it's with Down syndrome and other chromosomal disorders, the risk for various health issues increase, obviously depending on the disorder, and depends on the person too, but just the link is there. So one of the things that they recommend for people with Down syndrome is those to address the other risk factors like diet, exercise, lifestyles, so that the risk for dementia is decreased.
A young and agile mind. Very good. Emily?
Yeah, it's just interesting the amount of research that's coming out on this. And she mentioned it in her paper too, but things like brain games or ways to keep your mind active, somehow prevent those plaques and tingles from even happening. And then of course, just living a healthy life, being active and eating healthy foods, that's a big one. But it's cool that yes, it affects a lot of people, but there still are things that we can be doing on a daily basis to kind of prevent it.
That's true, but plaque does build up.
Right.
I mean, we all know
Yes.
people that get strokes. In the last year, I went from having 0 people in my life who have had strokes to 2 or 3. I've lost count now. And it's, that's just a real thing. Sometimes it's just a natural cause and you're predisposed to that. And that's where she was getting to. Sometimes you're just predisposed to having this malady because that's just where your genetics are, and the plaque builds up. It's hard to deal with. So the earlier you can catch it, so maybe you can try to forestall it. At some point, maybe break it up, the plaque buildup. Is that where you're going? Yep. Okay. All right. Don't mess with the nurse. Jenna?
I was just going to say we learned about this in lifespan psychology, about how it would be interesting to study the impact of dementia on the loved ones who are taking care of them and the people around them too, and just what that can do to you seeing someone decline like that.
It would probably vary person to person. I would bet it makes you hyper aware of your own cognitive health. That would be my guess. That's a guess. Okay. Is that you good, Yuritsa? No? Anything else, Jordan?
Kind of going along with what Jenna said, just the effect that watching it, and yes, I was about that big, but seeing the effects of it in their children is the worst a lot of the time, because you try because that's who raised you, and you try to help them see what's happening because you want them to understand, and just weighing that between, okay, do I just let either lie to them because that whole like, I lied because I love you, but trying to take care of them in that way. But I had a question, and I don't know if there's an answer to this, but I wondered if there was a difference in percentage in gender, especially with those, and I'm not trying to offend anybody, I promise, those who, if there's a lower percentage in men who've worked their whole lives as opposed to women who may have stopped in an active job, I say active job, stopped in a career to stay home and take care of the children, because it's a different way to just absolutely exhaust your mind. But I wonder if there was a different percentage in that we've seen because of the brain stimulation and things like that. But I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's been any studies done, and I think all my nurses have left the room. So, well, no. Dr. Hulk, do you know of anything?
I don't know of anything that indicates people who choose not to have a career, females who choose to stay home, or become mentally, I think a lot of it's who you are as a person. And if you are somebody who is, who enjoys reading and, using your brain and staying aware of things that are going on in the world around you. And yes, your children are there, but you're also learning all the time with teaching your children and trying to stay ahead of them. So, interesting question. I don't know what the answer is, but my guess would be probably not a factor in the development of dementia.
Yeah, I'm glad there's somebody that could confirm my suspicions, because I think it has more to do with your mental agility based on what you're doing personally. Because you can find plenty of slugs sitting in offices. Right. Not that I'm saying anything about anyone I know, but it has nothing to do with your mental keenness. You can find plenty of keen people raising kids at home. I know of one in this room, right? Raised our 3 kids at home. Pretty sharp. So, thank you. Anything else?
This is mostly just a comment from what I've read and just heard on podcasts or whatnot from Matthew Walker. He said there's something special about the brain waves and mostly what the effect that deep sleep has on us. Particularly, it slows down our brain waves and lowers our body temperature, which somehow, as Jesse had mentioned, the plaque, the beta amyloid that builds up in our brains, somehow that is broken down or decreased over time as we get a better sleep. So get 8 hours of sleep.
He says during midterm week. Well, it is true. We find so many times, the Bible is the truth, and we are told again and again about how we need to treat the physical bodies that we have and be good stewards. And I think that goes a long way towards what even secularists would say. You need to make sure you're getting your proper sleep, proper nutrition, make sure that you are doing what you should be doing as far as socializing with others in the best way possible. And so all those things help with the lack of a mental decline, but it doesn't forestall it. And what Emily was getting to is true. I mean, is there some way to break down the problem early on? Could be. It could be. So spiritual outlook certainly is part of it. You find that as well with a number of health questions, and certainly I think with dementia. But again, that's not the silver bullet. So in all these things, we look to God for his guidance and help, and especially with the strength to know how to deal with others that are coping with this. So we'll hope that Jessie is as well as possible. And did anybody go out to check on her? She is good. Good, good. Well, let's give her a round of applause one more time. And our last presenter of the night, again, is one of our elementary ed students. Chloe Sneed from the state of Alabama is going to present to us about the role of parents and the support of students in schools. So Chloe, come on up and I'll get the laptop for you.
Hi, my name is Chloe Sneed. I'm a senior in the education department here at Florida College. This is my third presentation with the honors program, and I just love the opportunity that we have to get to do this. So before I officially get started, I just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Crispell for organizing all of this and making this possible, because it really is just so special and so fun, honestly, for all of us nerds who like stuff like this. But I know he puts a ton of time and a ton of effort into this. So this is my last presentation, so I felt like I could take the time to say that without him telling me that I'm embarrassing him. So. But as this is my last presentation, if you have been to either of my other ones, you probably have seen a pattern, and that is that I tend to enjoy kind of hot button topics. So my first presentation, I talked about standardized testing in schools, which you can imagine, there are a lot of different opinions on that. My second presentation, I talked about COVID and the effects of e-learning, which also lots of different opinions. And now I will be presenting on the role of parental support, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and educational success. So also a lot of different opinions, I know, on the role of parents in the educational process, but I hope that the research that I've done can help you kind of see a little bit clearer what a child needs from parents and from teachers working together in the schools. So, for a while in America, there has been a big push for equality in education, which is a wonderful goal. But we started to really kind of see this take effect in law in the way that I'm looking at this equality in 2001, when President Bush passed No Child Left Behind. This was a law that talked about equality of educational opportunities, saying that each child should be receiving the same opportunities and the same services, and really just making sure that everyone is getting exactly equal treatment. No one is getting left behind. And we have even seen it change over the years. It's now been changed to the Every Student Succeeds Act under President Obama, but still has most of the same goals. However, it is difficult, if not impossible, to make education equal. And I hope that you don't take that too personally until you give me a few minutes to explain this. So, children are in school from about 7 to 8 hours a day, usually 4 to 5 days a week. So if you average that out, it gives you about 35 hours in school. And that comes out to about 20% of a child's week. So the other 80% is spent outside of the school building and outside of the classroom. So it would be difficult, if not impossible, to make education and the opportunities to students equal when 80% of their lives looks so different. And when parents are getting involved, a lot of times there's question over what that really means. But parental involvement, a definition I found that I thought really encapsulates what it means now, is the participation of parents in regular, two-way, and meaningful communication involving student academic learning and other school activities. And I love that this says two-way communication, because this is not entirely on the parent. The teacher plays a huge role in this too, but there needs to be that two-way communication for parents to be involved. Parent involvement has been proven to increase a child's academic performance. In multiple studies I found that were performed in multiple countries, such as England, America, Norway, Iran, and more. Now, there is such a thing as too much parent involvement, which was evidently clear in the studies that I saw as well. One study that I was particularly interested in talked about too much parent involvement, and this one was particularly interesting to me because it didn't focus on the academic effects on the child, but talked about how a parent being over-involved in a child's development, especially from the ages of 3 to 6. This is looking like maybe we would call them a helicopter parent, someone who wants to do everything for their kid, make sure that their life is totally perfect, steps in whenever there is a problem. And it found that these kind of parents, their are children, when they reach school age or get a little bit older, have severe issues with their emotions and behavior. And so there is too much of a good thing. But these are not the type of parent involvement that I am choosing to focus on tonight. So as I've been in the classroom with my internship, I have seen a lot of different methods of communication from teacher to parent. One of the methods that is primarily used right now in classrooms is the Remind app. And this allows teachers to not have to use their personal cell phone number. The account is linked to their cell phone, so the messages will come to their phone. But parents don't have access to that teacher's personal number to call or text them at any time of the day. Teachers can set office hours or school hours in the Remind app to where they won't be notified outside of those hours if they don't want to be. And it also allows them to communicate with the parents of the class as a whole if they need to just push out general reminders or just send out information, maybe class photos, things like that. But it also allows them to communicate with each parent one-on-one, all on the same platform. So that's been used in a lot of classrooms that I've seen. A lot of teachers also still use class newsletters, whether that's weekly or monthly, that go home to kind of update parents on what's happening in the classroom. Maybe reminders, sometimes they'll send even the lunch menu on the newsletter, just so that parents are in the loop and have all of the information that teachers need them to have. Teachers use a behavior log a lot so that parents know how their child is performing not only academically at school, but also socially, emotionally, behaviorally, because academics doesn't encapsulate the full picture of a child's educational experience. And a lot of teachers have an important folder as well. Some classes may use a yellow folder, some may use a red, but especially in primary grades, this is a folder where parents know that they can look to find anything that needs to be left at home, because sometimes students are not entirely responsible enough to be able to go home and hand their parents a piece of paper and say, "Here, my teacher said you need to have this." So those are just a few methods that I've seen used in the classroom. And I do want to note that not all teachers establish this regular and positive communication, and that falls onto the teacher. I don't want to excuse that at all. This is definitely a two-way street. But I think we can all agree that all of that effort that goes in from the teachers who are having that positive and regular communication, it can be extremely disheartening when they're being ignored or treated poorly, disrespected by parents who they are trying to make an effort to reach out to. So that parental support is a two-way street, but it has been proven to increase a child's academic performance. The second thing I found extremely interesting when I was doing my research for this was Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a topic that I first heard about in some of my psychology classes and have heard more and more about it as I've gotten further into the field of education. And probably about a month ago now, I was at an intern training day where all of the student teachers in Hillsborough County got to hang out together for a day, and they told us all of the things that we are not allowed to do in the classroom, all of the things that can get us sued and fired, and they also told us a lot of helpful information about things that we can do. But one of the quotes that stood out to me a lot was, "Before we can get to Bloom's, we have to address Maslow's." For those of you who aren't familiar, Bloom's taxonomy is a questioning system that has 6 levels, extending from lower level thinking to higher level thinking. It begins with knowledge questions, which are just simple recall, and moves on to comprehension, analysis, application, evaluation, and synthesis. And I didn't have to look any of those up to remember them. And so this questioning is used frequently in schools, and a lot of times it's even a check mark. Were there higher level thinking questions in this lesson? Were there lower level thinking questions? But before you can really address those with a child, you have to start with the basics. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a 5-tier model of human needs. And in this model, Maslow states that the levels must be satisfied from the bottom to the top. So he's saying that you can't have, for example, belongingness and love needs. Those don't really matter if your physiological needs are not being met. So this can have a great effect in class and at home. The first one that I want to focus on is physiological needs. So if you'll think about physiological needs, Maslow's typically defines them as food, water, warmth, and rest. So I want you to just take a moment and think about how you would be feeling if you had had no food at all for 20 hours. I think a lot of us can probably say that we would not be at our best. I know I'm a person who gets a little hangry sometimes, and I probably wouldn't be the most pleasant to be around at that point, and that's a long time to go without food. I think we'd all agree. So why 20 hours, you might ask? That is about the time that a child would go from school lunch to school breakfast the next day. So for children whose only meals are coming from school, they are spending roughly 20 hours with no food if they are not receiving any food at home. And this is something that happens. This is something that occurs probably more than we would like to admit or like to realize. But imagine that you have had no food for 20 hours, and now imagine that you're 6 years old. And I think it's easy for us to understand how that could extremely, extremely affect a child's education. So it can cause problems like retaining information. They might have behavioral struggles, different things like that. And then let's think about how we feel when we don't get enough sleep. I know as college students, we often are on the, I got 4 to 5 hours last night. I'm dragging a little bit, but I've got, my venti Starbucks to get me through today. But children age 6 through 12, which is generally school age, should, according to Johns Hopkins Children's Hospital, be getting 9 to 12 hours of sleep a night. So this is extremely important for a child, for them to be getting a healthy amount of sleep, for them to be getting good, calm, restful sleep, for them to have a good sleep schedule, because when they are not having these things, students may fall asleep in class. They may struggle to focus or behave, and they will have difficulty retaining any information that they do hear. And when I thought about this, I thought about the times that I've seen teachers wake students up from sleeping in class. And I thought about, what would I be thinking if I was to be woken up in a time when I just desperately needed sleep? I hadn't been getting enough sleep, probably for multiple nights for a lot of these students. And a teacher woke me up and said, you need to pay attention, you need to wake up. What do you think that child is going to be thinking for the next hour? Are they going to actually be processing that information and retaining things and interacting with their peers? Because I know for me, what would be running through my mind is, don't fall asleep, don't fall asleep, don't fall asleep, on repeat until I was able to get that sleep that I needed. So those are just a couple examples of how these physiological needs can affect a child at school. The second tier that I want to look at is belongingness and love. And in this tier are our intimate relationships, so our close family and our friends. Unstable relationships or other emotional distress is not something that a child can just leave at home. Worrying about tension or arguments at home is not conducive to learning. And a teacher can take this into account, but only if they know that it's happening. And this is another way that parental support plays into this educational process, because this requires communication from the parent to the teacher. Because as teachers, we hear a lot of things, and it's hard to know what's true, it's hard to know what to believe, and a lot of these things are not things that kids are going to want to bring up on their own, because they probably don't really understand the full extent of it and the effect that it's having on them. So that really requires that parent communication and that two-way street of both parties involved, parent and teacher, saying, okay, I care about this child, I want what's best for them. How can we work together to make that happen? When I was looking at the belongingness and love tier, an interesting study I found talked about household chaos, which was a term that I was not familiar with, but is defined as the level of disorganization or environmental confusion in the home. It's characterized by high levels of background stimulation, lack of family routines, absence of predictability and structure in daily activities, and an overly fast pace of family life. And so I think a lot of times when we think about a lack of parental support or a home environment that isn't the most conducive to a great education for a student, we think about families of divorce, multiple transition families, which are essentially families where parents are divorced or not together and mom or dad gets remarried to someone else, single parent households, and those type of situations. But when looking at this definition of household chaos, this could be any type of home. Any type of home can be disorganized to a level that has a lack of routine, a lack of predictability and structure, or an overly fast pace of life. Especially for small children, it's important for them to have routines and predictability in the home. And so the study that I looked into with this found that the household chaos that was present in these situations was directly linked to adverse outcomes in 7 different areas of a child's life. And the 4 that I think most apply to the educational experience were the cognitive and academic area, socio-emotional and behavioral, communication, and physical health. And these are areas where it's really important for children to be receiving that consistency at home and have positive effect in all of those areas in order for them to be learning the material that they should be learning, for them to be interacting with peers in a positive way, and all of those great things that we want to happen in a school. So that was a lot of negative things, and I'm aware of that. But as Christians, it's our goal to make the world a little bit better and to shine our light anywhere we go. And so you may be thinking, okay, I'm not a teacher. What am I supposed to do about this? But there's lots of things that we all can do, thankfully. So for increased parent support of learning and education in the home, family reading time has been proven to really help kids academically, which doesn't even have to be reading aloud to kids. A particular study that I saw found that even just seeing their parent read for 10 or 15 minutes, even just to themselves with a book, just sitting quietly and reading, increased a child's desire to read and therefore increased their academic performance. Positive attitudes in the home regarding school, teachers, and all of that, even administration. I think a lot of times it's easy to pin a lot of problems on the school system or on teachers, but if a child constantly hears a parent or significant person in their life talking about all the problems with their teacher or all the problems with their school, they are also going to pick up that negative attitude towards school. And also, reading to children and expanding vocabulary has been proven to increase academic performance and help students in education. So this may look like just reading a book for 5 or 10 minutes before bedtime every night, or when you're out and about, just pointing to words on signs you may see or in the grocery store and saying them out loud, or having a child try to read them to you. Those are all great things that parents can do in the home or anyone who spends time with kids. And then for meeting physiological needs of students, and this is really where I feel like the community comes into play. So you can connect with a local charity or organization that provides food to students and families in need. I know almost every city that I've been to has had at least one organization like this. The one in my hometown is called Sydney's Safe Foundation, and they send home bags of food with students every weekend, so that over the weekend, those students have food at home, and they have food for their siblings at home, or even for their parents, because that may be their only food for the weekend. So there are lots of opportunities like that. There's also allowing guidance counselors to step in and speak with students and provide help resources. If you talk to a guidance counselor at a school that you're associated with, they can point you to a lot of the resources that may be working directly with the school system that you're associated with. And also, people can establish or donate to a clothes closet for students. A lot of schools, especially high schools, have things like this where students can just come in, no questions asked, and grab a t-shirt or grab a pair of jeans. Because that kind of goes back to Maslow's, I'll go back and show you guys, but that esteem needs where you want to feel like you are, important and that other people value you and that you are accomplished. Students who are wearing the same clothes for a week, especially once they get to that middle school and high school level, are going to be thinking about that constantly and worrying about the perceptions of other students towards them. So that's a great option for them to just be able to go get that taken care of, because that top level self-actualization is where all of the learning and creating actually takes place. So our goal is to get students all the way up to that level. So those are a few solutions that I found in my research. I'm sure there are even more. But in short, parental support is vital in a child's educational experience. And we as teachers, parents, and Christians need to do all we can to make sure that the playing field is even for every child and just that they're getting the love and care that they deserve. Thank you for listening.
So I feel like a big part of like this communication with parents is probably pride. Like they don't want the teacher to know what's going on in their personal lives or at home. And asking for help is probably a really hard thing to do if like they're embarrassed of their situation. So I was just wondering something that you could do as a teacher in the classroom to help get over that barrier, make them feel more comfortable.
I think it's really important to establish that communication from the get-go. And I know a lot of teachers who will say in like their beginning of the year letter or in their meeting with parents, like, hey, I want to help, but if I don't know, I can't help. And this is not about you and it's not about me, it's about your child. And so a lot of times I know when teachers will say it that way and say like, I want best for your child and I know that you do too. It's like, it kind of helps parents see that they're on the same team and that they want the same things. And so I know that can remedy it a little bit, but sometimes you do run into parents who just don't want anything really to do with that kind of communication.
I don't know that this is really a question necessarily. I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but I find it interesting and discouraging that, one of the trends we've seen in parenting recently that has had a negative impact on kids' like cognitive development is the fact that there's so many built-in babysitters for parents now. They can plop them in front of a screen and that kid will sit there and stare at the screen for however long until the parent decides they feel like, spending time with their kid. And from an education standpoint, I think a lot of the time that those parents previously would have spent with those kids would have been doing things like helping them develop cognitively instead of the kids staring at a screen. And so, I think we, like, just from a standpoint of like how we can help, like as parents in the home, like just going to putting in effort to spend time with your child instead of just treating the raising of the child as a responsibility and a burden and see it as a privilege and want, the best for that child. And, that's all kind of like things that good Christian parents are likely going to be focused on anyway, but that's just something I've been thinking about.
No, absolutely. I think, and especially conversation has a huge impact on a child's development, because where they hear those words and that vocabulary, that's where they learn to speak. And eventually reading comes from that, and then writing, and then so many other things. But yeah, if they're not feeling cared for and loved by their parent, if they just feel like an obligation, then it's not going to be a great environment for their development. Absolutely.
It's more just a comment. I thought it was interesting looking at the STEAM needs and kind of like tying it with like me growing up. I very much like over time, like just with my relationship with my mom, took on like what I was taught as far as like the look I'd get if I got a B on a test, much less if I got a B in a class, like, and that type of thing, and how much that is like family, and that is taught and that is passed down to where, like, you know, it doesn't take my mom looking over my shoulder for me to care a lot about my grades. And I just thought that was interesting. But, yeah.
I was going to talk about how language barriers, like if English isn't a first language, how parents might not want to reach out to a teacher or be able to communicate their needs for their child in that.
We actually had a situation like that today where a student who speaks only Spanish and the parents also speak only Spanish were reaching out over concerns that really were just miscommunications between other students and their child. And so honestly, the Remind app is a great way that a lot of teachers have found to use that because it will translate things for you, like to and from different languages. So I think parents are able to set their native language and then what language they want to receive messages in or translate it into English, all those different things. So that's been a great help, and especially as technology has increased, like I know Google Translate isn't perfect, so if there's any foreign language people in the room, sorry, but it's a great tool to use in schools too, because even just that basic communication, even if it's not exactly the way that it would be said in their language, like it helps them understand. Like that student who I'm talking to, he was waiting to be picked up and parents were running late. And I was trying to ask him, you know, who's coming to get you today? But he doesn't understand anything that I'm saying. All he's saying, and I kept hearing one word over and over and over again. So I Google translated that word, and it meant work. And so I said, Mom's at work. And he said, and I was like, oh, okay, great. So just like those technology resources have been a great help. And also Florida is a really great state when it comes to like teaching students English and just teaching speakers of other languages. It's a huge program in Florida that if you've ever taken an education class, you've probably heard at least a little bit about it. But I would say mostly technology and also just knowing the resources that are at the school, because not every language you're going to have somebody at the school who speaks it, but a lot of times there will be someone or even another family that you can ask, like another student, to help.
That's cool that you were able to recognize what word he was saying and translate that.
Took a few times.
What are some examples of things that you'll be able to do as a teacher to kind of increase parental involvement in the classroom or outside of the classroom?
I do think that communication starts with the teacher. Like the teacher should be establishing that constant and positive communication even from the beginning of the year, if not before the year starts. Like, you know, when parents get the class assignments and the class roster, it should be the teacher's role to say, like, hi, this is who I am. I'm really excited to have your student in class. You know, and so just establishing that positive relationship from the get-go and keeping up with that. Like, if you tell parents that you're going to send a weekly or monthly update, like, teachers need to hold to that and stick to it because parents are expecting that. And so when you show that you're putting in effort and when you show that you care about the child, parents are a lot more receptive. You're always going to run into cases of parents who are not interested in communicating with the teacher, but I think when the teacher makes the effort first, it's a lot easier for parents to reciprocate that than maybe approaching someone who they don't really know anything about or aren't familiar with about a problem that they're having when it does arise.
Too, Chloe, I'd say the principal has a huge role in that, setting a standard and expectations for the teachers and also for the community. Smaller the town, the more effective the principal can be. And so they can set a standard, but then it comes down to the teacher actually carrying it out. So.
Something that we can read a lot about and see a lot of research about is people in all areas of life getting trapped in like cycles. And I feel like in education we see this a lot. I've read a lot of books and articles about it. Like if you have a parent who dropped out of high school, when they have a child, it might be that they're not going to care about their child's education either because they didn't care about their own. And then so that child then grows up with a negative view towards education. Their parent might not be sending them to school every day. They might have like a high absence rate, things like that. So the cycle just keeps on going. And you can see it on the other end too. Like if a parent has a college education, they will likely, be very involved with their child's future education, and really emphasize the importance of that because they saw the importance of it themselves and they reaped the benefits from it. So how do you think that teachers can help address these cycles in students even when they're young, and like encouraging them to help step out of or help break cycles that are negative that they might be experiencing?
I think just making the classroom a positive place and a safe place for students goes a long way with a lot of those things. Just making all students feel like they are safe to learn and grow in the classroom, and that they are welcome there and they are wanted there, and that school isn't just a place where we do hard things and learn all of this stuff that, like, when am I ever going to use it again? But it's also a place, like, to learn about the things that interest you and to make connections with your friends. And so establishing your classroom as a safe space and as a welcoming place and a place where learning can be fun and learning can be exciting, I think can really help instill that love of learning, especially if it's at the very beginning of the school experience with kids. But it definitely is a cycle, because I think we've all seen, if we've been in classrooms, like kids who just have a ton of absences and it's just because they wanted to stay home or something like that. And I think a lot of that would also come to just like positive school communication as a whole. And if you're a teacher who gets that child maybe in a later grade, maybe you have to kind of disregard what other teachers say and just let them have a fresh start and try to help them see that even if they didn't enjoy school before, they can like it now and that kind of thing. But that is a really tough cycle to break, definitely.
Well, people and children, I mean, children are just little people, very rarely rise above the expectations that are set, positively or negatively. And parents either have a positive or negative. Very, very rarely is it just neutral about a discipline or a school experience. It could be with a specific discipline. Well, I just didn't like math, or I just didn't like English. Of course, everybody likes history, so that's not the problem. But, and where's that carry over? Well, you know, the kid's not going to like math. I mean, it's a rare child. It's going to rise beyond the expectations of the parent or the teacher. So your job is to make it as exciting as and interesting as possible, you know, within reason. But, you know, you're the one that sets the tone. So you have a huge influence, Macy. You don't have the silver bullet, again, for this one either, but you make a huge difference.
So you mentioned whenever you were talking about kind of the basic tier, things that are detrimental to a child is living in a disorganized home. And the way that I could be misunderstanding, but it seemed to be different from like dysfunctional or where there's a divorce or things like that happening. What are some specifics? I guess, what do you mean by disorganized?
So that was the definition of household chaos that I saw. So the characteristics that it gave of the disorganization were the high levels of background stimulation. So maybe they're living in a home where there is constant noise and constantly just kind of people like running around, or like maybe there's always loud music or always like a loud TV going, and that might make it hard for them to complete any homework that they have, you know, or a lack of family routine. So there's like no set time in the day where the child has to work on their homework, or like they don't have a set bedtime, or they don't have a set dinner time. Not that those things have to stay the same every day. You know, it's good for kids to know, like, this is what I need to do this evening when I get home, to some extent. An absence of predictability and structure. So just that same thing, just that variation of kids not knowing what to expect at all from when they go home. You know, who knows, is it going to be crazy and loud and noisy? Is no one going to be there? Like, what are we going to be doing tonight? Am I going to do my homework tonight? Am I going to eat dinner tonight? Like, you know, type of thing. And then the overly fast pace of family life, which is just like rushing from thing to thing to thing to thing without having really any downtime probably to spend as a family or to spend on those educational things, if that makes more sense. It's not just like a messy room or a kitchen. It's like that more level of like, it makes it hard for the child to think and to reason and to focus and to know what to expect and really like learn from their family.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
this is less of like a question more than it's like kind of me like reflecting on my own life and how like some of the stuff you've been saying. Because like growing up, my mom always encouraged me to read. I always come home with books from the library. And then once I got into middle school and high school, I was on the phone all the time and kind of gave up reading. But then once I got to college and kind of my senior year of high school, I just started reading all the time. Discovered that I still love to do it. And I'm still like, I'm kind of curious of like, can screen time be used as a way to stimulate educational enrichment? Because like we're saying, a new babysitter is just putting the iPad in front of the kid or something like that. And so can screen time be used? Because now I use my phone all the time as for learning random facts or going down rabbit holes for honors evenings and stuff like that. But mostly, like, can it still be used as a tool and not just a distraction?
Yeah, there was actually one study that I found that was very interesting and talked about the effects of using a screen to read to children. So maybe like having the pictures on a tablet or on a computer, or having the words even on the tablet. And it showed that in recent years, that has held a child's focus much longer than a paper book, which I don't love that personally. I think kids should still be getting their hands on real books and using them, but it is interesting that our society is shifting in that way to where a child is able to focus longer when the book is on a screen or a tablet or something like that. So I think there is a place for them in education, but I think there's also a lot of time in education where we should be teaching kids to explore things on their own and to learn to enjoy the things that they just have around them in the world.
Well done. I loved it. I was just wondering, is there anything you can do specifically as a teacher, like knowing that a child may not be reaching their full potential because of their parents? Like, is there anything that you could specifically do in the classroom?
Yeah, so I think a lot of things that I've seen other teachers do and that I've started to pick up are like when you have those down moments maybe in the classroom, especially with younger kids, you pull that kid aside and you say, hey, let's read together. And you know that's maybe not a kid who's getting read to at home, but you're like, hey, for these 5 minutes, I can read out loud to them, and I can track with my fingers so that they see the words that I'm reading, and I can ask them questions to make them interested in the story, or like things like that, and just practicing words, practicing letters and sounds with kids. I'm in kindergarten, so a lot of these things are very foundational. But even just with older students, like taking the time to show interest and to show that you care. I found with older students, like last year when I was in 5th grade, when I would ask them questions about their writing and be like, oh, what do you mean by that? Like, oh, I love that detail that you showed. Like they're a lot more willing to share out and kind of go that extra step that you might know that they have in them, but they don't really want to like do the extra work or maybe like read a story in front of the class or something like that until they see that they have that approval and security. So I think it's different things with different ages that you can do to help them kind of do that, but really at the bottom line, just showing that you care first is going to open that student up to working harder and like giving you their best, because when you have a relationship, students want you to be proud of them and they want you to approve of their work. And so I think that makes a big difference on any level. But on the different levels, there's different things that teachers can do.
Thank you.
From the audience? Yes.
So I was wondering, let's suppose for a second, like some student has been in the school system for a while, but their education has been neglected by their parents, and down the line, the parents are realizing that and start trying to crack down on that. Is there a window where it's like it's too late now? Like let's say they've gotten into later high school, maybe they're in their junior or senior years. Is it too late to help, try to help them catch up to get to the point where they can go to college, succeed in life, or get like a career or something, get a degree?
I don't work a lot with high schools or high school kids, so I don't know the exact like housing wise. I know GPA is a big factor with a lot of high school kids. So I know a lot of times when it gets to a point of like it feels like it's kind of too far gone, if you're trying to salvage it, a lot of times schools will turn to retention, having students repeat a grade or repeat classes. I know some of the kids from my class in high school went on to get their GEDs instead of walking in 4 years. With us, they would complete online courses and different things like that. And so I think there definitely are ways that you can turn that around and really like make it a positive thing. I don't think that ever needs to be the end of the line, just like, oh, well, I've been bad at school for this long, so I guess there's no use trying. Like, that's never an attitude that anyone should foster in a student. But I think it would depend on the case and the school and all the procedures and probably what that student wanted to do in college or in career. So.
Now, you're talking about individual drive and motivation, which is going to be hard to gauge. Is there ever a time where you just say, well, that's enough? We can't go any further with this person. School's not going to do that, and at least not outwardly. But for the person, it's going to come down to a teenager. Do they have the drive and motivation, perhaps to overcome what they don't have at home, which is kind of where Chloe's come at it from tonight. Kathleen?
I wonder about the level at which a teacher can handle all of the problems that an entire classroom of kids could bring. I mean, we all know that there are school systems that are failing school systems, and that the neighborhoods that are feeding into those schools, there are families that are struggling and, you know, just trying to make ends meet and you know, 3 jobs and no one at home with the children. And like, what is in the school system that helps teachers not to end up burning out, and that helps them still be able to educate when there's so much emotion and upheaval when you care so much about these kids and there's only so much that you can do?
I can tell you a few things that I've seen. I know every school is going to be different, and I haven't been in like a Title I school or anything like that where they really have problems with like the majority of the students. I've worked with students of a lot of different backgrounds, and I've talked to teachers who have worked with a lot of different students and in a lot of different schools. But in schools right now, they have a lot of guidance support usually for students like that. Like, that would be probably the first place that I as a teacher would turn to if I had a student who was struggling with like the home life side of things, like not getting support, maybe not getting enough food, not getting enough sleep. The guidance office usually has a lot of resources when it comes to that, which also depends on the school that you're at, if they will or not. But also in schools, there's a program kind of called RTI, which is Response to Intervention, and there's 3 tiers. And so tier 1 is your general classroom students. And if they are proving to be academically successful at tier 1, they stay at tier 1 for as long as that keeps going. If they're not successful at tier 1, they'll move to tier 2, where they will receive some intervention. Maybe they're in a pull-out group that gets pulled out 20 minutes a day to work on maybe a specific phonics skill or a specific reading skill or something like that. And so if that proves effective, then they will stay with that group until it shows like, okay, they really don't need this anymore. But if that tier 2 intervention is not effective, they'll move to tier 3, which is much more extensive remediation, pull-out groups, maybe even looking at a different class for that student. So that's one program that a lot of schools use that just helps track where students are and how teachers can meet their needs without it becoming overwhelming, because that's an easier way to kind of see where all of your students are as a class instead of just looking at each student one by one. Obviously, you have to look at each individual student to know where to place them, but that allows you to kind of handle those problems in a group or with other teachers.
That gets to the academic, and that's helpful, and that's vital for them. The social problems and the questions, you're describing why teachers burn out. Without the proper support from principals and other administrators that can help them with different programs, they're going to burn out because you can't possibly meet the needs of every single student. Teachers by nature are idealistic at the start, by nature. Very few people, and it's a common joke, very few people go into it for the money. It's just the way it is. You go into it to help people. So I taught 10 years at a middle school, you know this, and some days you would just want to take a kid home because you know what they're going home to, and you can't do that. And so as a young teacher, I would just, if a kid was a problem, I would say, look, I don't know what you're going to have happen at home. This is what I expect from you in this classroom. This is the level I expect from you in this classroom, and you're going to live up to it. Or you and I are going to go down and see Mr. Williams, and I get to spank 1 student a year, and you might be it. And that, by the way, that was true. We still had corporal punishment. This isn't being recorded, is it? I'll probably get arrested, right? My social credit score is going to go down. And so you do the best you can, and everybody's personality is a little different when it comes to that. Suzanne?
So, part of the problem, it kind of goes to what Lisa was saying about cycles. So, in our environment here, we've been taught a lot about family, and a lot about raising kids, and a lot about responsibility, but not everyone comes with that foundation. Did you read anything about programs that literally try to educate parents on like how to be a good parent, or what's expected of parents, or either on a classroom basis? A lot of times it's a little bit broader than the classroom basis.
Yeah, some of the studies talked about like they met with parents beforehand doing the study and had like taught one group of parents how to maybe like an effective way to read to the child, or like an effective way to communicate with them about what they're learning at school, and then had like a control group where they just did nothing with the parents. So I think there are some ways that parents can, and I think especially now with the internet, which not everyone has access to internet 24/7, but a lot of people do make that a priority. And so I think a lot of times you can find great resources on there. I know the teacher that I'm working with right now has sent parents a lot of different like websites and programs that they can use that they might not even have to know the material at all, but they can just like let the child use it, and then that is a form of at-home support, because, you know, that's something that's not happening during the school day. It's additional instruction. A lot of times it's specifically targeted to what the child needs. So I think it just depends on the case and what the family has. But I've also seen teachers like send extra books home with kids, or send like letter and sound cards home with kids who they know that they maybe don't have the internet access to use those kinds of things. I don't know if that totally answers what you were asking, but...
Anything else? Yes.
Well, kind of to that end, I know in Hillsborough County at least, they have iMom and All Pro Dad, which are two groups that Tony Dungy is in charge of, the All Pro Dad one, and they push out content to try and get schools to get dads together to have a dad breakfast with their kid and talk about good things to do. And then iMom, similar concept for the moms that just kind of encourages that parent relationship. For those that don't know how to do better and do right by kids. But I was thinking too about the parents, and you just get such a clearer picture of the whole kid's story when you meet their parents. And the faster you can meet them, the better you understand what they're working with. And there would be some kids, I wouldn't even meet their parents until the last conference night of the year in April, and I would go, that explains so much, because you get where they're coming from and understanding all the factors that have made them who they are. But that's also the beauty of this field of education, is that for 180 days you get to create your little household classroom that's not chaotic, and give them an example of a choice of what it can be like and what it can look like. And that's the beauty of this mission field, that it gives you a space to do that and change lives for children. Great job. Thank you.
Anything else from the panel? Ruth, anything? Good? Seth? We all want to go home and get our naps and stay cognitively healthy is what it is. Chloe, thank you very much. Well, we've come to the end of our evening. Again, we appreciate you being here very much. Chloe's very sweet to say what she did. I'll remind her there's no grade for this class. It's really, and I mean to say this every so often, but it's really our honor to work with them. Dr. Dilbeck and Mrs. Witherington and Dr. Gilliam and Dr. Stafford and Mr. Chandler all work in various ways within the honors program, so I'm indebted to them, and we're all indebted to you. This is what makes it worth it in many ways. So. Again, thank you for your work. Appreciate you all being here tonight. We will have a few other honors evenings this semester, but the next one is not until later in March, so be watching for that. And until then, thank you again for being here, and we wish you all good night.